Rod Stewart has sold more than 250 million records. He has 8 children by 5 different women, a knighthood, and a reputation as one of rock's great romantics. The leopard print, the raspy voice, the endless string of famous girlfriends and wives. But in a 2025 interview with The Times, the 80-year-old singer said something that cut through decades of tabloid gloss. Talking about the end of his marriage to supermodel Rachel Hunter, he said it tore me to shreds. He wasn't talking about a fling. He was talking about the one that got away. To understand why that admission matters, you have to go back to the beginning. Long before the fame, when Rod Stewart was just a teenager from North London who was about to make the first of several choices he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain. Roderick David Stewart was born on January 10, 1945, in Highgate, North London, the youngest of 5 children of a newsagent. There was nothing rock and roll about his upbringing. What set the pattern for the rest of his life, though, happened when he was still a teenager. At around 17, Stewart was involved with an art student named Susannah Boffey. In November 1963, the couple had a daughter. Stewart has said publicly, including in a Joy Behar show appearance, that he wanted the baby placed for adoption almost immediately, explaining that he was absolutely stone broke and in no position to raise a child. Susannah tried to care for the baby alone for a period before agreeing to adoption. Their daughter, later known as Sarah Streeter, spent time in foster care before being adopted at around age 5 by a family named Thubron. Sarah didn't learn the identity of her biological father until she was 18, when her adoptive parents finally told her. She and Stewart met a handful of times in the 1980s, but the relationship never really took root, and contact between them largely dried up for roughly 2 decades. It wasn't until after the death of Sarah's adoptive mother, around 2007, that father and daughter began rebuilding a relationship, one that continues today, with Sarah eventually reconciling with several of her half-siblings. She has said in interviews that she came to a place of understanding rather than resentment, in contrast to her birth mother, who reportedly remained estranged from Stewart for the rest of her life. This first chapter is easy to skip past in the retelling of Stewart's love life, because it doesn't involve leopard print or arena tours. But it set a template. A young Rod Stewart, faced with a relationship that came with real consequences, chose distance. It's a pattern that would echo, in different forms, for the next 3 decades. It's also worth pausing on just how ordinary that choice was for a working-class teenager in early 1960s Britain. Adoption was, for many unmarried couples of that era, treated as the default response to an unplanned pregnancy, a decision shaped as much by social stigma and financial precarity as by any individual failing. Stewart's own explanation, that he was stone broke and in no position to raise a child, reads less like an excuse and more like a plain description of his circumstances at the time. What makes the story notable isn't the decision itself so much as what came after, a gap of roughly 2 decades in which father and daughter had almost no real relationship, followed by a reconciliation that only began once fame, money, and time had changed the terms entirely. By the time Stewart and Sarah Streeter were building something real, he was in his 60s and she was a grown woman with a family of her own. The years in between simply couldn't be recovered, and both of them have acknowledged as much in separate interviews over the years. By the mid-1970s, Stewart was one of the biggest rock stars in the world, and his personal life had become tabloid fodder. In 1975, he began a relationship with Britt Ekland, the Swedish actress best known at the time for playing Mary Goodnight opposite Roger Moore in The Man with the Golden Gun. She was one of the most photographed women on the planet. Their relationship, which lasted a little over 2 years, became genuinely entwined with Stewart's music. Ekland provided the whispered French vocal on the outro of Tonight's the Night, Gonna Be Alright, which reached #1 in the United States in 1976, and Stewart wrote You're in My Heart, the final acclaim, during their time together. The relationship ended in 1977 after Stewart was photographed with another woman, actress Liz Treadwell. According to accounts from the period, Ekland learned her relationship was effectively over from a phone call from George Hamilton, an ex of hers, who had just discovered his own former wife, Alana Hamilton, was now involved with Stewart. Ekland didn't leave quietly. She filed a palimony suit against Stewart seeking $12.5 million, arguing that she had put her career on hold to support his. The case is a genuinely notable footnote in celebrity legal history. It's cited in general accounts of American palimony law as one of the earlier, higher-profile suits of its kind, following the landmark Marvin v. Marvin case that established the legal concept a year earlier. Sources differ on the exact resolution, some reporting a settlement worth roughly $500,000 in property, others describing the suit as ultimately dismissed by the courts. What's consistent across accounts, though, is that Ekland has said publicly, more than once, that Stewart never apologized to her for how the relationship ended. Decades later, when the subject came up on the British talk show Loose Women, Stewart reportedly acknowledged that Ekland was the one former partner who still wouldn't speak to him, and suggested she needed to move on, rather than reflecting on what had actually happened between them. It's a small but telling detail. Of everyone Stewart has loved and lost, Ekland is apparently the only one who has maintained total, permanent distance. Every other major relationship in this story eventually thawed into some form of civility, co-parenting, or friendship. Ekland's didn't. Whatever passed between them in 1977 evidently left a wound that 50 years, and Stewart's own public reflections, have never closed. Stewart's next major relationship overlapped with the fallout from Ekland's departure. He married Alana Hamilton, George Hamilton's ex-wife, in 1979. They had 2 children, Kimberly and Sean, and divorced in 1984 after 5 years. By most accounts, of all Stewart's serious relationships, this is the one that ended with the least bitterness. Alana and Stewart remained on good enough terms that she has been reported to have hosted family gatherings that included both Kelly Emberg and Rachel Hunter, 2 other women who had come to occupy major chapters in Stewart's life, suggesting an unusually functional blended family, at least on the surface. That's notable because Emberg's own chapter was far less amicable in its ending. Stewart began seeing the American model Kelly Emberg while he was still married to Alana. The relationship with Emberg lasted around 7 years and produced a daughter, Ruby, born in 1987. It ended with Emberg, by her own account, raising their daughter largely on her own after Stewart moved on. She's spoken about how difficult it was to be in a relationship with someone she knew, on some level, wasn't right for her, a description that, in hindsight, could apply to more than one of Stewart's partners. Taken together, the Alana and Kelly years show 2 very different outcomes running in parallel. Alana Hamilton, older and more established by the time she met Stewart, seems to have had the tools, and perhaps the emotional distance, to walk away from the marriage without lasting bitterness, eventually becoming, by several accounts, one of the more stable presences in his extended family life. Emberg, by contrast, was left holding the more difficult end of the arrangement, raising a child largely alone while the relationship that produced her ran its course on Stewart's terms rather than a mutual one. It's a contrast that recurs throughout Stewart's history. The partners who kept a foothold in an independent life outside the relationship tended to come out the other side intact. The ones who didn't, generally didn't. In 1990, Stewart, then 45, recently divorced, and reportedly on the verge of proposing to Kelly Emberg, met a 21-year-old New Zealand model named Rachel Hunter at a Los Angeles nightclub. Hunter had already built a substantial modeling career, appearing in Vogue, Sports Illustrated, and Elle. She was, by multiple accounts including Stewart's own later reflections, unlike anyone he dated before, independent, financially secure, and unimpressed by his fame in the way he'd come to expect from other partners. The romance moved fast. Stewart has said he sent 24 roses to Hunter's management company shortly after they met, and within months the two were married. The wedding took place in 1990 at a church in Beverly Hills. Stewart's sister Mary reportedly expressed doubts at the time, feeling that Hunter, more than 2 decades younger than Stewart, was too young for the relationship to work. Stewart went ahead anyway. By his own account, the marriage to Hunter was the most faithful relationship of his adult life. They had 2 children, Renee and Liam, and Stewart has said the family often traveled together during his tours. From the outside, it looked like the version of Rod Stewart who had finally settled down. But in 1999, after 9 years of marriage, Hunter left. And what followed is, by Stewart's own repeated admission decades later, the relationship he has never fully made peace with. The most revealing account of that marriage doesn't come from Stewart. It comes from Hunter herself, in a 2001 interview given not long after the split. She described spending years inside a world that was entirely his friends, his schedule, his career, his life on the road, to the point that, by her late 20s, she said she could no longer answer basic questions about her own preferences. She didn't have a hobby. She said she felt she had become, in effect, nothing. That's a strikingly different account from the one Stewart has tended to give. In interviews across the years, most recently in that 2025 conversation with The Times, Stewart has described the marriage's end largely in terms of Hunter's youth and his own devastation. "Rachel left me because she was too young. My sister said I should never have married her in the first place, but it tore me to shreds," he told the paper. He's also said the split left him needing roughly 6 months before he was ready to date again, joking that a bandmate refused to hand over the phone number of the woman who would become his next wife because he wasn't ready. What Stewart's version leaves out, or at least what he rarely centers, is Hunter's side of it, a young woman who entered the relationship with an established career and a strong sense of self, and who says she gradually lost both inside a life built entirely around someone else's fame. Stewart's reflections tend to focus on his own pain at being left. Hers focus on what it cost her to stay as long as she did. Both things can be true, and taken together, they explain why this particular breakup, unlike the ones with Ekland or Emberg, wasn't caused by infidelity or a public scandal. It was slower and quieter than that, and in some ways harder to pin blame for, which may be exactly why Stewart still frames it as something that happened to him rather than something that happened between the two of them. There's also something worth noting in the sheer scale of the age gap, a 24-year-old difference, with Hunter marrying at 21 and Stewart at 45. Stewart's sister Mary reportedly raised concerns about that gap before the wedding even happened, and Stewart has since said, in the 2025 Times interview, that his sister had been right all along. That's a rare thing for him to concede so plainly, an admission that the warning signs were visible from the outside even if he couldn't, or wouldn't, see them from the inside. It doesn't undo what Hunter has said about losing herself in those years, but it does suggest that Stewart, looking back from 80, understands at least part of what went wrong, even if his account still centers his own heartbreak more than her account centers hers. After the marriage ended, Hunter rebuilt a public life and career largely independent of Stewart. Modeling work, television appearances, and eventually a home and family life of her own in New Zealand and the United States. Their 2 children, Renee and Liam, have remained part of Stewart's large extended family, appearing alongside half-siblings from his other relationships at gatherings over the years. Whatever the marriage cost Hunter in her 20s, by most accounts she went on to reclaim the independence she said she lost during it. About 6 months after Hunter left, Stewart met Penny Lancaster, a model who had been photographing one of his tours. Lancaster has said in interviews that she wasn't particularly familiar with Stewart's music before they met and wasn't looking for a relationship at the time. Whatever the initial circumstances, something about this pairing worked differently than the ones before it. Stewart and Lancaster married in 2007 in Italy and have been together since, by a wide margin, the longest relationship of Stewart's adult life. They have 2 sons, Alastair and Aidan, bringing Stewart's total number of children to 8. In the same 2025 Times interview in which he discussed Hunter, Stewart described Lancaster as having mended my heart in more ways than one, and spoke about their relationship with a warmth and steadiness that's largely absent from how he talks about his earlier partners. At 80, Stewart has also spoken about his 2023 prostate cancer diagnosis, his enormous model railway collection, and a generally quieter, more domestic version of the life he used to live in tabloid headlines. It's a softer public image than the one built in the 1970s and 80s, a man who, by most outward signs, finally figured out how to stay. Laid end to end, Rod Stewart's major relationships tell a fairly consistent story, and it isn't really about him being a villain. Susannah Boffey was left to carry the consequences of an unplanned pregnancy largely alone, at a point when Stewart had neither the money nor, by his own admission, the maturity to do otherwise. Britt Ekland says she never received the apology she felt she was owed for how publicly and abruptly their relationship ended. Kelly Emberg was left to raise their daughter largely on her own. And Rachel Hunter, in her own words, lost track of who she was somewhere inside 9 years of being married to one of the most famous men in the world. What connects these stories isn't cruelty so much as absence, a version of presence that showed up as a performer, a provider, a headline act, but rarely as a partner paying close attention to what was happening to the person next to him. That's arguably the real thread running through the interview that prompted all this renewed attention. Stewart, at 80, finally naming Rachel Hunter as the person he regrets losing most, while still describing the loss almost entirely in terms of his own devastation, rather than in terms of what 9 years inside his world had cost her. So who is the one woman Rod Stewart says he shouldn't have let go? By his own words, it's Rachel Hunter, the woman he has called the one he truly believed would last, and whose departure he still describes as the moment that tore him apart. But the fuller version of that story, the one that includes Hunter's own account of those years, suggests the woman worth mourning isn't quite the one Stewart names. It's the 21-year-old who walked into a Los Angeles nightclub in 1990 with an established career, financial independence, and a life that belonged entirely to her, before 9 years inside someone else's world quietly took much of that away. Sources: The Times, 2025, via reporting in Hello, Entertainment Daily, and music-news.com. Good Morning America/ABC News. Adoptions with Love. Wikipedia's entry on U.S. palimony law. Song facts. IMDb.